So, over Halloween, I thought I should at least try to play a scary game, but since I'm a big scaredy cat, the closest thing I could get to was a game from one of my favorite series, Metroid Fusion. Released in 2002 on the Game Boy Advance, it was the first Metroid game to be released directly following Super after a long 8-year wait. Yeah, long waits for Metroid games is not something that's new. The story of this game is that while exploring the planet SR-388, Samus gets infected by a freaky alien parasite known as the X. The X have the ability to replicate any organism that they've infected, and the infection later causes Samus to crash her ship into an asteroid field. Samus is in a coma and the X-parasite threatens her life, but fortunately a cure is found in the form of DNA from Metroids, who happen to be the natural predator of the X. Samus makes a recovery, but the incident leaves her in a much weakened state. She is later sent to a space station orbiting SR-388 in order to investigate an explosion that occurred, along with her new ship and AR partner that she named Adam. But they soon discovered that the station has also been overrun with the X-parasite, who have been able to replicate all the organisms aboard the station, as well as Samus herself in the form of the SAX, which is the game's main antagonist. And now, once again, it's up to Samus to save the day. The gameplay of Fusion is very similar to that of Super Metroid. It's a 2D platforming, side-scrolling shooter, but it has a few key differences to it. One of the things that was added in Fusion is that now Samus has the ability to grab onto ledges. I assume this was added because, compared to Super, the player has a bit less control while in the air. So to compensate for this, they added ledge grabbing, which makes the platforming a little more forgiving. I think that this is an overall very positive addition to the Metroid control scheme. It fits very naturally within the already existing gameplay, and it helps make the movement in Fusion feel very fluid and satisfying. And it also removes some of the more awkward situations that the player might get into with the old gameplay, like trying to get into a morph ball tunnel that's in the middle of a wall. Another new feature is the ability to climb on certain walls and ceilings. This is another addition that I really like. It gives the player a new way to traverse the area and helps make things like long corridors or vertical shafts much more interesting. And it's also used in some of the boss fights for really interesting effects and moments. Something else that's really neat is the effect that the X-parasites have on the gameplay. When the player defeats an enemy, instead of dropping the usual ammo or health pickup, they then turn into an X-parasite, and when the player absorbs them, they will restore either health or ammo. The twist is that if the player isn't able to absorb them fast enough, then the X will reform into another enemy, or even combine with another to form an even stronger enemy. This adds a really interesting dynamic to all of the encounters in the game, where now the threat isn't over as soon as an enemy dies. It makes the player look at the situations in the game much differently than they would in other games, and might make them put themselves in more dangerous situations than they would otherwise. This extra layer of danger fits really well with the game's theme of Samus being vulnerable, and it's interesting that they were able to make the X both a threat and a benefit to the player. Pretty much like every other Metroid game, the game world of Fusion is fairly large and open, but compared to other Metroid titles, the way you move through that game world feels pretty linear. This is caused in part by how the game world is structured, but it's mostly due to how the game deals with its progression. The space station is split into 6 different sectors, each with their own unique environments, and a main deck that interconnects them all and acts as a sort of hub. This structure allows the player to move in between the different sectors fairly quickly and easily, and thus move from any one point on the map to any other fairly quickly, making stuff like exploration and backtracking much easier. The trade-off is, since that the map is now split into 7 equally sized areas, those areas are now relatively smaller, and as such much simpler. With less space to work with, there's less room for things like branching paths or hidden areas, and exploring the areas can begin to feel like you're following a set path instead of finding your own. I'm not trying to say that the level design in Fusion is by any means bad, it's just a little less complicated than what you'd find in some of the other games in the series. It's still a Metroid game, and as you would expect, the level design is extremely competent. There's still plenty of interesting areas to explore and secrets to discover. As I said before, the main reason for the linearity is due to how the game handles its progression. The progression in Metroid Fusion is much more objective-based and story-oriented than a lot of other games in the Metroid series. The way the player makes progress in the game is not by exploring and finding new abilities, but by completing specific mission objectives given to them by the game and progressing the story. Things like what abilities they have and where they can go are all dependent on their progress in the story. Unlike other Metroid games that never really give you an explanation for why you're there, Fusion will almost always give the player an objective that tells them where they need to go and what they need to do, whether that be finding a specific ability, unlocking doors, or defeating a specific boss. The problem with the objectives is that they discourage stuff like exploration and backtracking because it shifts the focus of the player onto the objective rather than exploring the world. The bigger problem is that it takes a significant amount of agency away from the player. Now the game is telling the player exactly where they need to go rather than the player having to figure that out for themselves. You see, in Super Metroid, finding where you needed to go was just as much a part of the challenge as getting there was. You had to explore not to just find the extra items, but also to find the way forward. The only thing you really needed to make any progress was just the correct abilities to get past any obstacles in your way. It was a lot more natural. Even if you were following the intended path, it still felt like you were finding your own way. And since progress only really depended on what abilities you had, if you could find the abilities in a different order or even get past an obstacle without the correct ability, you could go through the game in a completely different way each time. But in Fusion, because your progress is tied directly with the story, there's really only one way you're ever going to go through the game. The doors are locked not because you don't have the right weapon to open them, but because the story says it's not the right time for them to be opened. And even if there are obstacles that require a specific ability to get through, you won't get that ability until the story gives it to you. And even if you wanted to go back and explore previous areas now that you have the ability to explore more, there are a lot of times when the game will just straight up not let you enter old areas because the story said so. The game being much more linear is a direct result of Fusion being much more story-focused than any other Metroid game at the time. Fusion was the first Metroid game to really give us any information about the character of Samus and the world around her. Now, the weird thing about the story in Fusion is that it's both the best and the worst parts of the game. What's bad about the story is how it affects the gameplay. As I just said, the game being much more story-focused means that it has to be a lot more linear, which can turn a lot of people off. But it also has the tendency to interrupt the gameplay a little too much. One thing new to Fusion is the navigation rooms. This is where you can talk to your ship's AI, Adam, who will give you stuff like map data, details on the situation, and your next mission objective. This is primarily how the game's story is told, the other methods being either Samus's inner monologues or a few cutscenes. The problem with these is that there are a lot of them. There's one at the beginning of each of the sectors, and they're frequently placed throughout the entire map. Whenever Adam has something to say, he will lock the doors and not let you leave until you've talked to him, and you have to talk to him a lot. Within the first area, you have to talk to him about 6 times within the span of a few minutes. It would have been nice if the game let you skip at least some of these, or if they cut down on the amount of them. Interrupting gameplay like this really hurts both the game and the story you're trying to tell. You're interrupting the pacing of the game and making it feel slow and sluggish and taking the player out of the experience, and you're also making the player apathetic to the story, because now it's presented to them as just something annoying they have to sit through. Now, what's great about this story is pretty much everything that's conveyed non-verbally to the player. In terms of stuff like atmosphere and tone, I think that Metroid Fusion is one of the strongest Metroid games in these regards, and that's pretty high praise considering the Metroid series is known for being very atmospheric. Metroid Fusion succeeds in making the player feel alone, scared, and vulnerable. Its creepy music does a perfect job at setting the tone, the game world has a lot more variability so the player will always be on their toes, and they even set up a lot of the bosses really well as threats. I know a few people might scoff at me saying that this game or any other Metroid game have horror elements to them, but there are a lot of parts in this game that really only exist just to put the player on edge. I mean, just look at the introduction of the SAX. The first time you see that is genuinely terrifying. It completely surprises the player because it seamlessly blends the gameplay into a cutscene, and the imagery of looking into the visor and those blank eyes staring right back at you is just chilling. The SAX is set up really well as a threat, and it really contributes to the atmosphere in making the player feel paranoid. It'll appear throughout the game seemingly at random, scaring the player and forcing them to either hide or run away. It also does a really good job of reinforcing the idea of Samus being in a weakened state, as it serves as a perfect comparison for how strong she used to be, and it'll usually kill the player in about one shot. Now, here's what's really weird about this. Not only does the story both have really good and really bad parts to it, but the good parts of the story are kinda dependent on the bad parts of it. There are a few sequences in the game where it'll do something that interrupts the usual gameplay of following objectives by either cutting off the player and making them find a new way forward, or making them go through an area that they're not supposed to. In these little sequences, the game gets rid of stuff like navigation rooms and mission objectives and just leaves the player completely on their own. These are also where the SAX is most likely to appear. These sequences are some of the best parts of the game. They're filled with a lot of tension and mystery, and they really contribute a lot to the game's overall atmosphere. As I said before, the weird part about all this is that if some of the things that I find negative about this game, like Adam or the mission objectives, weren't in this game, then these sequences wouldn't have nearly the same effect. Metroid Fusion has its flaws, but overall it's a really great game and a really strong entry into the Metroid franchise. Compared to some of the other games in the series, it's not what a lot of people might expect it to be, but ultimately the things that are different about this game are what make it memorable. The atmosphere it's able to create is incredible, it showed that Metroid could still work with modernized gameplay, and it even made some genuine improvements to Metroid. While I may not find it as impressive as I do some of the other games in the Metroid series, I still really like Metroid Fusion. I remember playing this game for the first time when I was younger, and it's scaring the crap out of me, which is impressive when you consider that this was on a Game Boy Advance. It really made me change how I look at the entire series, and it has a lot of examples of all the things that I love about this series. I tried to make this video more like a typical review where I try and judge whether or not a game is good, and the answer that I've reached for is Metroid Fusion good is a resounding yes. Thanks for watching, and thanks for playing.